Hi, welcome back. Today we are at chapter 4 at the grandmother's. On the following morning, the bright sun appeared again, and Peter came with the goats, and they all went together up to the pasture, and so it happened day after day. Heidi grew very brown and strong and healthy from this outdoor life, and she was as happy as the merry little birds in all the trees in the green woods. It was now autumn, and the wind was beginning to blow louder over the mountains. So the grandfather said one day, "You must stay here today, Heidi. The wind with one puff could blow a little thing like you over all the rocks and down into the valley." But when Peter heard this in the morning, he looked very unhappy, for he saw real misfortune before him. He did not know how to pass the time. It was so tiresome when Heidi was not with him. He missed his hearty dinner. Moreover, the goats were so contrary these days that he had twice as much trouble with them. They were so accustomed to Heidi's company that they would not go along, but ran off in every direction, because she was not with them. Heidi was never unhappy, for she always found something about her to enjoy. She would have preferred to go with Peter and the goats to the pasture, to the flowers, and up to the robber bird, where there were so many things to do with all the different goats. But still, her grandfather's hammering and sawing and carpentering was very interesting to Heidi. It pleased her that he was just preparing the pretty round goat cheeses. Since she had to stay at home, it was particularly delightful to watch the remarkable operation of her grandfather as he bared both arms and stirred the cheese in the big kettle. But more attractive than all else to Heidi on such windy days was the roaring and rushing in the 3 old fir trees behind the hut. Wherever she happened to be, she had to run to them every little while, for nothing was so fascinating and wonderful as this deep, mysterious sound up in the tree tops. Heidi would stand under them and listen. She was never tired of seeing and hearing how the wind roared and rocked the trees with such might. The sun was no longer hot, as in summer, and Heidi brought out her shoes and stockings, and also her little coat, for it grew cooler and cooler. When she stood under the fir trees, the wind blew through her as if she were a thin leaf, but she kept running back again, and could not stay in the house when she heard the wind. Then it grew cold, and Peter breathed on his hands when he came early in the morning, but not for long, for suddenly, one night, a deep snow fell. When the sun rose, the whole elm was white, and not a single green leaf was to be seen anywhere about. After this, goatherd Peter came no more with his flock, and Heidi looked with amazement out of the little window, for it was beginning to snow again, and big flakes fell thick and fast, until the snow came up to the window, and then still higher, until they could not open the window, and they were completely buried in the little house. This made Heidi so merry that she kept running from one window to the other to see how the snow was increasing, and whether it would cover the entire hut, so that they would need to have a light in the middle of the day. It was not so bad as that, and the following day the grandfather went out with his shovel, for the storm was ended. He piled up great heaps of snow, so there seemed to be mountains of it all around the hut. Now the windows and the door were free, and this was fortunate, for as Heidi and her grandfather were sitting in the afternoon on their 3-legged stools, suddenly there was a great knocking and stamping against the threshold, and finally the door opened. It was Peter the goatherd. He had not kicked against the door through rudeness, but in order to beat off the snow from his shoes. Indeed, Peter was covered with snow, for he had been obliged to struggle through the high drifts, so that great lumps remained clinging to him, frozen fast by the sharp cold. But he had not given up, for he was anxious to reach Heidi, whom he had not seen for the whole long week. "Good afternoon," he said as he entered, then placed himself as near as possible to the fire and made no further remark. But his whole face beamed with pleasure at being there. Heidi looked at him wonderingly, for now that he was so near the fire, he began to thaw all over, so that he looked like a little waterfall. "Well, General, how are you?" asked the grandfather. "Now you are without an army, and must bite your slate pencil." "Why must he bite his slate pencil, grandfather?" asked Heidi at once with curiosity. In winter he has to go to school, explained the grandfather. There you learn to read and write, and often it is hard work, so it helps a little if you bite your slate pencil. Isn't it so, General? Yes, it is so, said Peter. Heidi's interest in the matter was now aroused, and she had to ask Peter a great many questions about the school and everything that happened and was to be seen and heard there. As much time was always spent in any conversation in which Peter was obliged to take part. The result was that meanwhile he was able to get well dried from top to toe. It was always a great effort for him to put his thoughts into words, to express his meaning. But this time it was unusually difficult, for he had scarcely succeeded in giving one answer before Heidi put 2 or 3 more unexpected questions, and mostly such as required a whole sentence in reply. The grandfather had kept quite still during this conversation, but the corners of his mouth had twitched with amusement, and this was a sign that he was listening. Well, General, now you have been under fire and need strengthening. Come, stay to supper with us. Whereupon the grandfather rose and brought the evening meal from the cupboard, and Heidi pushed the stools to the table. Next the wall there was still another seat, which the grandfather had made and fastened there. Now that he was no longer alone, he had fashioned here and there all sorts of seats for 2, for Heidi had a way of always keeping near him wherever he went. So they all 3 had good seats, and Peter opened his round eyes very wide when he saw what a big piece of fine dried meat the almuncle laid on his thick slice of bread. Peter had not had anything so good for a long time. When the pleasant meal was over, it began to grow dark, and Peter started for home. When he had said good night and God bless you, and was already in the doorway, he turned round once more and said, Next Sunday I will come again, a week from today, and you must come to my grandmother's sometimes. She said so. It was a new idea to Heidi that she should go to visit someone, but it took root on the spot, and on the following morning Heidi's first words were, Grandfather, now I must really go down to grandmother's. She expects me. There is too much snow, replied the grandfather, putting her off, but the purpose was deeply seated in Heidi's mind. After that, not a day passed when Heidi did not say 5 or 6 times, Grandfather, now I must really go. The grandmother is expecting me. On the 4th day, when the cold was so bitter that it cracked and creaked with every footstep outdoors, and the whole covering of snow was frozen hard all about, and yet the beautiful sun looked in at the window, Heidi, as she sat on her high stool eating her dinner, began her little speech again. Today I must really go to the grandmother's. She will be tired of waiting for me. Then the grandfather rose from the dinner table, went up to the hayloft, brought down the big thick bag that served as Heidi's bed covering, and said, Well, come along. The child was greatly delighted and skipped after him out into the glistening world of snow. In the old fir trees it was now quite still. The white snow lay on every bough, and the trees sparkled and shone all over in the sunshine so gloriously that Heidi jumped up and down with delight and kept exclaiming, Come out, Grandfather, come out. The fir trees are all covered with real silver and gold. The grandfather had gone into the shop and now came out with a wide sled. It had a handle fastened to the side, and from the low seat one could hold the feet out in front against the snowy ground and steer with one or the other in the required direction. After the grandfather had first looked all around the fir trees with Heidi, he seated himself on the sled, took the child in his lap, wrapped her up in the bag so that she might be warm and comfortable, and held her tight with his left arm, as this was very necessary for the coming journey. Then with his right hand he seized the handle and gave a push with both feet. The sled shot down the mountain with such swiftness that Heidi thought she was flying through the air like a bird and shouted with joy. Suddenly the sled stood still in front of Peter the goatherd's hut. The grandfather put the child on the ground, unwrapped her covering, and said, Now go in, and when it begins to grow dark, come out again and start along on the way home. Then he turned around with the sled and drew it up the mountain. Heidi opened the door and went into a little room which looked black. There was a fireplace in it and some bowls on a stand. This was a kitchen. Then came another door, which Heidi also opened. This led into a small sitting room, for this was not a cheesemaker's hut, like her grandfather's, with one single large room and a loft above it, but a very old little house where everything was small, narrow, and old-fashioned. When Heidi stepped into the little sitting room, she stood right in front of a table by which sat a woman mending Peter's jacket. Heidi immediately recognized it. In the corner, an old, bent grandmother sat spinning. Heidi knew at once who she was. She went straight to the spinning wheel and said, "How do you do, grandmother? I have come to see you. Did you think it was a long time before I came?" The grandmother raised her head and sought for the hand held out to her. When she found it, she felt it for some time thoughtfully. Then she said, "Are you the child staying up with the elm uncle? Are you Heidi?" "Yes, yes," replied the child. "I have just come down with my grandfather on the sled." "Is that possible? Your hand is so warm. Say, Bridget, did the elm uncle himself come down with the child?" Peter's mother, Bridget, who was mending by the table, had risen and was now examining the child with curiosity from head to foot. She said, "I don't know, mother, whether the uncle himself came with her or not. It is not likely. The child may be mistaken." But Heidi looked straight at the woman and said sturdily, "I know very well who wrapped me up in the coverlet and brought me down on the sled. It was my grandfather." "Then there must be something in what Peter said last summer about the elm uncle, although we thought he was not right," said the grandmother. "Who could really have believed that such a thing was possible? I thought the child wouldn't live 3 weeks up there. How does she look, Bridget?" Bridget had studied her so thoroughly in the meantime that she could well describe her appearance. "She has a delicate form like Adelaide," she replied, "but she has black eyes and curly hair like Tobias, and also like the old man up there. I believe she looks like them both." Meanwhile, Heidi was not idle. She had looked around and noticed everything. Now she said, "See, grandmother, there's a shutter that keeps swinging back and forth. My grandfather would drive in a nail at once to hold it fast. It will break a pane of glass. See, see." "Oh, you good child," said the grandmother. "I cannot see it, but I can hear it, and much more besides the shutter. Everything creaks and rattles when the wind blows, and it comes in everywhere. Everything is loose, and often in the night, when both the others are asleep, I am so anxious and afraid lest the whole house should tumble down over our heads and kill us all three. And there is no man to mend anything about the hut, for Peter doesn't know how." "But why can't you see how the shutter swings, grandmother? See, there it goes again. There, there, there." And Heidi pointed with her finger directly toward the place. "Ah, child, I can see nothing at all. Nothing at all, the shutter or anything else," said the grandmother mournfully. "But if I go out and open the shutter wide so it would be quite light, can you see then, grandmother?" "No, no, not even then. No one can make it light for me again." "But if you go out in the white snow, then it will surely be light for you. Just come with me, grandmother. I will show you." Heidi took the grandmother by the hand to lead her out, for she was beginning to be distressed, because it did not seem light anywhere to the old woman. "Let me sit still, you good child. It would be dark to me even in the snow and in the light. My eyes cannot see." "But then in the summertime, grandmother," said Heidi, still anxiously seeking some way out of the difficulty. "You know, when the sun comes down quite hot and then says good night to the mountains, and they shine fiery red, and all the yellow flowers glisten, then it will be light to you, won't it?" "Ah, child, I can never see them any more. The fiery mountains and the golden flowers above us will never be bright to me on earth, nevermore." Then Heidi burst into loud weeping. Full of distress, she kept sobbing, "Who can make it get light again for you? Can no one? Can no one at all?" The grandmother tried to comfort the child, but she did not soon succeed. Heidi hardly ever cried, but when once she began, it was almost impossible for her to recover from her grief. The grandmother had tried every means to soothe the child, for it went to her heart to have her sob so pitifully. Finally she said, "Come, dear Heidi, come here. I want to tell you something. When a person cannot see, it is so pleasant to hear a friendly word, and I like to hear you talk. Come sit down near me and tell me what you do up there and what your grandfather does. I used to know him well, but for many years I have heard nothing much about him, except through Peter. But Peter doesn't say much." Then a new idea came to Heidi's mind. She quickly wiped away her tears and said comfortingly, "Just wait, grandmother. I will tell my grandfather all about it. He will make it light for you again, and he will fix the hut so that it won't tumble down. He can make everything all right."